As they watched, the tension in the air grew thicker. Emma's heart raced as she saw the first signs of the calves' arrival. It wasn't going as smoothly as they had hoped. The cow was struggling, her breaths coming in heavy gasps. The vet's calm demeanor couldn't mask the underlying tension in the barn. Emma squeezed John's hand, a cold shiver running down her spine as she realized just how fragile life could be. The vet's quick movements were becoming more urgent now. The cow's labor had taken an unexpected turn, and Emma's worst fears suddenly seemed all too real. Chapter 1: The Decision to Get Cows. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh hay and the earthy fragrance of soil. John sat on the old wooden rocking chair on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands. His thick, graying beard and worn but gentle eyes told stories of decades spent on the farm. Emma, his wife of 42 years, joined him shortly, her soft cotton dress fluttering in the breeze. She carried a basket of freshly collected eggs from their hens, the morning's first task. As she sat next to him, she placed the basket on the small wooden table, her hands warm from the sun. "Well," John said, breaking the silence, "it's been a good year for the garden. We've got plenty of vegetables, the chickens are laying well, and the pigs are looking healthy." Emma smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She had always appreciated John's optimism. "You're right, it's been a good year," she agreed, brushing a few stray hairs from her face. "But I think it's time to take the next step. The farm could use a little more, don't you think?" John raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "More? What do you have in mind?" Emma's gaze wandered across their small farm, from the chickens pecking at the ground to the pigs lazily basking in the sun. She had always been the dreamer of the two, while John tended to focus on the practical. "Cows," she said simply. "I've been thinking about it for a while now. We've got the space, and we could use the milk, especially with winter coming." John leaned back in his chair, considering her words. They had always kept their farm small, content with their chickens, pigs, and a couple of goats. But cows, that would be a whole new undertaking. He scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Cows? Huh? That's a lot of work. And they're expensive, too." Emma nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "I know, but I've been reading up on it. There's so much we can learn, and we could even sell some of the milk. It's a good investment, John." John looked out over the land. Their small homestead had served them well, but the thought of expanding was both exciting and daunting. The idea of raising cows, handling their care, feeding them, and milking them every day was no small task. Yet something about it felt right. Maybe it was the idea of adding another layer of life to their farm, or maybe it was simply the challenge of doing something new. "You know, I've heard from the neighbors that cows are a lot more demanding than we might think," John said, his voice thoughtful. "It's not just about feeding them and milking them. There's the barn to maintain, the health checks, and the care during calving. It's a lot to take on." Emma leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I know, but we're not doing this blindly. We can learn from others. And we've got the time, John. We've got the land. We've got the energy, too. For as long as we keep ourselves busy." John smiled at her, the familiar sparkle in her eye giving him confidence. Emma had always been the one to see the possibilities. And while he was more cautious, he couldn't help but feel that perhaps she was right. Perhaps it was time to push the boundaries of their small farm and take on something bigger. "All right," John said after a moment, setting down his coffee cup. "Let's do it. But we need to be smart about it. Let's make sure we know exactly what we're getting into. I'm not going to spend all this time and money only to find out we're in over our heads." Emma grinned, her eyes shining with excitement. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next few days, John and Emma spent hours discussing the logistics of getting cows. They researched online, scoured books from the local library, and even spoke with neighbors who had experience with dairy farming. Each conversation seemed to bring a new perspective, from the care required to feed and milk the cows to the types of barns and fencing that would work best for them. The more they learned, the more they realized just how much they needed to prepare. One afternoon, after they had spent the better part of the day reading and discussing, Emma sat down with her notebook, ready to make a list of the things they needed to do. "We'll need to build a barn. Not too big, but big enough for 5 cows," she said. jotting down notes. We'll need to buy hay and feed, and we'll have to figure out the milking process. I've read about some local farms that give tours. Maybe we could go visit one. John nodded, pleased with her proactive approach. That sounds like a good idea. We'll learn firsthand what it takes to care for them. Maybe we can even get a sense of the day-to-day routine. Emma flipped through the pages of her notebook. And we'll need to look at the breeds. Some cows are better for milk production, while others are more suited for beef. We're looking for milking cows, so I think Holsteins or Jerseys might be good choices. We'll have to figure out which one suits us best. John leaned back in his chair, thinking over all the things they had discussed. A lot of planning was ahead of them, and they had to be diligent about every step. He wasn't one to rush into things without thinking it through, but as he looked at Emma, so determined and eager, he felt a swell of pride. They had spent years building this farm from the ground up, and adding cows was just the next chapter in their journey. You know, John said slowly, this might be just what we need. It'll be hard work, no doubt about it. But I think we can do it. We've done hard work before. Emma's smile widened. We've always managed, haven't we? And this time we'll do it together. We'll make it work. With the decision made, John and Emma set their sights on the future. They spent the next week planning their trip to visit the dairy farm. They knew that seeing the process in action would give them the final push they needed. They were determined to be fully prepared before they brought the cows home. There was much to learn, but they were ready for the challenge. In the meantime, they continued to care for their existing animals, tending to the pigs, chickens, and goats with their usual attention and love. But now, there was an added sense of anticipation in the air, a spark that both John and Emma felt as they began their journey toward expanding their farm with cows. As the sun began to set on that quiet evening, they sat together on the porch once more, looking out over the land. The chickens were settling in for the night, the pigs were grunting contentedly in their pen, and the breeze rustled through the trees. It was a peaceful scene, but now there was the promise of something new, something exciting on the horizon. They were ready to take the next step, and they would do it side by side, just as they always had. The cows were coming, and with them a new chapter in their story. Chapter 2, First Impressions of the Dairy Farm. The morning fog had just begun to lift as John and Emma made their way down the narrow country road toward the dairy farm. The journey had been quiet, with only the occasional chatter between them about what to expect. Both were excited, but also apprehensive about what they would find. They had spent weeks planning and dreaming about bringing cows to their own farm, and now it was time to see how it was done on a larger scale. They were about to visit a modern dairy farm, one that was much bigger than their own little homestead, and they hoped to learn as much as they could. When they pulled into the gravel driveway, they were greeted by the sight of a large, well-organized farm, with rows of immaculate barns and neatly fenced pastures. The farm was bustling with activity, workers moving between the barns, tractors rolling across the fields, and cows grazing peacefully in the distance. It was a far cry from the simplicity of their own farm, and Emma's eyes widened in awe. "Look at this, John," she whispered, taking in the scale of the operation. "It's incredible. So much to see." John was equally impressed but tried to hide his surprise behind a thoughtful expression. He had seen farms before, of course, but this was different. Everything seemed so well arranged, so precise. "It's a big place," he said, "but I guess it has to be to handle this many cows." They parked near the main building, where a tall, broad-shouldered man was waiting for them. He introduced himself as Steve, the head farmer, and offered a firm handshake. He had the look of someone who had spent his whole life around animals. His weathered face and calloused hands told the story of decades of hard work. "Welcome to our farm," Steve said with a warm smile. "I'm glad you're here. I'll show you around and answer any questions you have. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started." John and Emma followed Steve as he led them toward the first barn. As they walked, Steve began to explain the layout of the farm. "We have about 300 cows here, all milk-producing Holsteins. They're well-suited for our climate and have a high yield of milk. We've invested a lot of time and money into ensuring they're well cared for. It's all about consistency and making sure we maintain a healthy herd." Emma nodded, absorbing every word. That's what we're hoping to achieve, she said. We're planning to start small with 5 cows, but we want to make sure we do it right. I've been reading a lot, but there's nothing like seeing it firsthand. Steve smiled. That's the best way to learn. And you've come to the right place. They entered the barn, and the first thing that hit them was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unmistakable. The rich, earthy scent of hay, the subtle odor of manure, and the clean, fresh smell of the cows themselves. The barn was cool, with sunlight filtering through high windows, casting soft beams of light on the rows of cows standing calmly in their stalls. Each cow had a nameplate above its head, and the floors were clean and well-maintained. The cows, large and black and white, stood in neat rows, some munching on hay, others lazily swishing their tails. The atmosphere was peaceful, yet there was a sense of organized chaos beneath the calm exterior. Workers moved between the cows, checking their food and water, adjusting the gates, and ensuring everything was in order. Looks like they have a system for everything, John remarked, glancing around at the meticulous setup. Do you have someone here all the time to keep track of things? Steve nodded. We have a full team here and we operate in shifts. We need to monitor the cows throughout the day, feeding, cleaning, and of course, milking. It's a lot of work, but when it's done right, it runs like a well-oiled machine. As they continued their tour, Steve explained the feeding process. The cows were fed a combination of hay, silage, and grain, all carefully balanced to meet their nutritional needs. We've worked with nutritionists to design a feeding program that maximizes milk production while keeping the cows healthy. It's a delicate balance, but we've got it down to a science. Emma listened intently, taking notes in her notebook. I can see how important the feed is, she said. We're going to need a system like this, especially if we want to keep our cows in good health. They moved on to the milking area next, which was one of the most impressive parts of the farm. It was a large, sterile room with shiny metal equipment, and several cows stood in a row, their udders attached to automated milking machines. The cows didn't seem to mind at all. They stood quietly, as if they were used to the routine. This is where the magic happens, Steve said, gesturing to the machines. We milk the cows 3 times a day, and each one is done in about 10 minutes. The machines are connected to a computerized system that tracks each cow's milk yield. It's efficient and precise. Emma's eyes widened as she watched the process. I didn't realize how much technology goes into this. The cows don't seem bothered by it at all. That's the goal, Steve replied. We've worked hard to make it as comfortable as possible for them. The key is consistency. They know when it's time to be milked, and they're ready for it. John looked at the machines and then back at Steve. Do you think we could manage something like this on our farm? Steve shrugged. It depends on how much you're willing to invest and how much work you're ready to put in. The machines are expensive, but there are simpler systems you can use to start. The key is to start small, get comfortable with the process, and then build from there. You don't need everything all at once. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what we were hoping to do. Start small, learn the ropes, and then expand as we go. The rest of the tour was filled with more information about cow care, from health checks to breeding, and even how to handle the occasional medical emergency. The farm had a veterinary clinic on site, and the cows were regularly checked for any signs of illness. Prevention is key, Steve explained. We've learned that taking good care of the cows from the start makes a huge difference in the long run. As they finished the tour, John and Emma were filled with a sense of awe and excitement. The farm was more organized and efficient than they had ever imagined. It was a far cry from their cozy homestead, but they felt more determined than ever to try their hand at it. Thanks for taking the time to show us around, Steve, John said, shaking the farmer's hand once more. This has been incredibly helpful. No problem, Steve replied with a grin. I'm happy to help. And remember, if you ever need advice, don't hesitate to reach out. As John and Emma climbed back into their truck, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. The farm had been everything they had hoped for and more. It was clear that there was a lot to learn, but they were more than ready for the challenge. They had seen firsthand the dedication and hard work that went into dairy farming, and they were determined to bring some of that knowledge back to their own farm. As they drove back home, the sun began to set behind them, casting a golden glow over the fields. Emma turned to Johnne, a smile on her face. "Well, I think we're ready. Let's do this." Johnne grinned back, the excitement in his eyes matching hers. "I think so too." Chapter 3. The Miracle of a Calf's Birth. The day began like any other on the farm, quiet, peaceful, with the gentle hum of daily chores filling the air. Johnne and Emma had spent the morning tending to their usual tasks, feeding the chickens, checking on the pigs, and watering the garden. But today was different. Today they had a new sense of purpose, a new goal. They had learned so much from their visit to the dairy farm, but there was still so much they didn't know. And one thing they were about to experience firsthand was the miracle of birth. It was a warm afternoon when Emma received the call. The local vet, Dr. Harrison, had informed her that one of the nearby farmers, who had recently bought a Holstein cow, was going through the calving process for the first time and needed help. The farmer had asked if Emma and Johnne could come and witness the birth. They knew that this was the perfect opportunity to learn more about what would be required when their own cows gave birth. It was also an emotional moment, the beginning of a new life on their farm, even if it wasn't one of their own cows just yet. Johnne and Emma drove quickly, eager to be there in time. The farm was only a short distance away, nestled between rolling hills, and the drive was a pleasant one. As they arrived at the property, they were greeted by the farmer, a burly man named Tom, who looked both anxious and excited. He led them to a small barn at the edge of the property, where the expectant cow was waiting. The cow, a beautiful black and white Holstein, stood quietly in a corner of the barn, her body tense but calm. Her sides were swollen, and her belly had dropped, a clear sign that she was close to giving birth. Dr. Harrison was already there, preparing his equipment, and he greeted Johnne and Emma with a friendly nod. "This is Daisy," Tom said, motioning to the cow. "She's about to give birth any time now. I thought it might be helpful for you two to be here and see how it's done. I've never done this before, so I figured it'd be good to have someone with experience." Dr. Harrison smiled. "There's no experience like being here in person. We'll take it step by step. Don't worry, we'll guide you through it." Johnne and Emma stood quietly as they watched Daisy, who seemed to be taking everything in stride. Her breathing was slow and steady, and she shifted her weight every few moments, as if trying to find a more comfortable position. Emma stood next to her, gently stroking the cow's side. It was an odd mixture of excitement and nervousness. They were about to witness something incredible, something they had only read about or seen in books before. As time passed, Daisy's contractions grew more pronounced. Dr. Harrison and Tom kept a careful eye on her, watching her every move. "The first stage of labor can take a while," Dr. Harrison explained. "The cow will start to move around and lie down, and she may get up again a few times. It's all part of the process." Emma's heart began to race as she watched Daisy shift restlessly. She had never been this close to a birth before, let alone an animal birth. But there was something calming about the way Daisy handled the discomfort. Despite the intensity of the situation, she remained steady, focused. Finally, after what felt like hours, Daisy lay down in the straw. She let out a low moo, a sign that the birth was imminent. The tension in the air grew thicker as Daisy's body went through the final stages of labor. Emma's hand gripped John's tightly, both of them feeling the weight of the moment. "You'll want to be careful during this part," Dr. Harrison said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Once the hooves start to show, we'll need to help guide the calf out. But it's important not to rush things." Johnne nodded, feeling a mix of awe and responsibility. He watched as the first hooves began to emerge, followed by a slim, long snout. The calf's head was next, emerging slowly as Daisy pushed with all her strength. It was an incredible sight, the raw, natural beauty of new life coming into the world. With a final push, the calf slid free, its body unfolding onto the straw. Dr. Harrison quickly checked to make sure the umbilical cord wasn't tangled and that the calf could breathe. "It's a healthy one," he said with a smile. "A little bull calf. Congratulations, Tom." Tom, who had been standing by with bated breath, let out a relieved sigh. His face broke into a smile as he gently knelt next to Daisy and her newborn calf. "Thank you, all of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I didn't know what to expect, but it's amazing." Emma wiped a tear from her eye, feeling a deep sense of connection to the animal and the experience. She and John had spent so many years caring for their own animals, but witnessing the birth of a calf was something different entirely. It was a reminder of the cycle of life, of the responsibilities they were about to take on when they brought their own cows into the world. The little bull calf, still wet from the birth, let out a soft bleat, trying to stand on his wobbly legs. Daisy, ever the patient mother, nudged him gently with her nose, encouraging him to rise. Emma leaned in closer, her heart swelling with tenderness as she watched the calf take its first steps. "He's so small," Emma said softly, "but look at him, already trying to stand." John, who had been silently watching the whole process, nodded. "It's incredible. This is what we're about to be a part of." Dr. Harrison smiled at them. "It's a lot of responsibility, but it's also one of the most rewarding experiences. You'll be amazed at how quickly they grow." As the calf continued to find his footing, Daisy lay calmly beside him, her motherly instincts already kicking in. The bond between them was instant, deep, and natural. "We'll give them a little space now," Dr. Harrison said, guiding Tom, John, and Emma out of the barn. "Let them bond for a while. The calf will need to nurse soon." John and Emma stepped outside, the warm afternoon sun now bathing the barn in golden light. They stood together in silence, both feeling a deep sense of awe. What they had just witnessed was a miracle, the miracle of life, the beauty of birth, and the start of a new journey on the farm. "I think we're ready for this," John said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We can do this." Emma smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of excitement and wonder. "We absolutely can." As they walked back to their truck, the weight of the moment settled on them. They were ready to bring cows to their own farm, and when the time came, they would be prepared to help bring new life into the world, just as they had witnessed today. Chapter 4. Caring for the newborn calf. The air was cool with the first hints of autumn, and the light breeze carried the earthy scent of hay and fresh grass across the farm. John and Emma had returned home after witnessing the miracle of birth just a few days ago. They were both still riding the high of the experience, but their thoughts had quickly turned toward their own future herd of cows, and more specifically, how to care for the newborns that would inevitably follow. The small barn on their farm had been prepared for the arrival of their cows, complete with soft straw bedding and a spacious area for the calves. They had read up on everything they needed to know about caring for a newborn calf, from the essential nutrients to the steps required to ensure that the calf was healthy and strong. But it was one thing to read about it and quite another to put the knowledge into action. Today, they were faced with the first real challenge: caring for their own newborn calf, who had arrived just 2 days ago. John and Emma had decided to help Tom care for his calf and observe the process of bonding, feeding, and keeping the calf healthy. They were determined to be as prepared as possible when their own cows gave birth, and this calf was their practice run. "Morning, little one," Emma whispered softly, kneeling down beside the calf, a gentle brown and white heifer that had just begun to grow accustomed to her new world. She had been born just hours after they had left Tom's farm, and Emma's heart had already formed a connection to her. John was just finishing his rounds, checking on the other animals, but he paused when he saw Emma kneeling by the calf. He walked over, his boots crunching on the straw. "How's she doing?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. "She's doing great," Emma said, smiling at him. "She's nursing already, and she seems so strong. Look at her. It's like she's been here forever." The little heifer, named Bella, was lying on her stomach, her large eyes blinking slowly as she took in her surroundings. Her coat was still a little damp, but she had already learned how to find her mother's teats, nursing hungrily, her little body growing stronger with every sip. Emma gently stroked the calf's head, marveling at the softness of her fur. "She's just so tiny," Emma continued, her voice filled with wonder. "I didn't expect her to be this fragile, but at the same time, she's so determined. Just look at her." John nodded, his own eyes softening as he watched the calf. He had been nervous about the whole process, wondering whether they would be able to handle the responsibility. But seeing Bella now, Calm and content, he felt a sense of peace. "I guess we do the best we can," he said quietly. "But there's a lot more to learn, isn't there?" Emma chuckled, rubbing Bella's soft head. "Oh, there's plenty to learn, but we're on the right track." They spent the next hour watching Bella, making sure she was feeding properly and getting the necessary attention from her mother, who was a calm and attentive first-time mom. Dr. Harrison had emphasized how critical the first few days were for a newborn calf. They needed to drink plenty of colostrum, the first milk, which was packed with antibodies to protect them from disease. Emma had already made sure Bella had received her full share, and now it was a matter of ensuring she remained hydrated and healthy. "Do you want to help me with her first bath?" Emma asked, standing up and wiping her hands on her overalls. "We need to make sure she's clean and comfortable, especially around her belly and legs. She's been a bit wobbly on her feet, and I don't want her to get any dirt in those areas." John glanced at Bella and nodded. "I'll grab the bucket and the warm water. I'll be right back." Emma gathered the small brushes and towels that they had prepared the night before. It had been a learning experience when they visited the dairy farm. They had seen how carefully the farmers there tended to the newborns, making sure to wash them down gently and thoroughly after birth. It wasn't just about keeping them clean. It was about creating a calm, loving environment where the calf could bond with her mother and feel secure. When John returned with the water, they carefully began wiping down Bella, starting with her face and legs. The little calf was initially a bit fussy, but Emma's soft voice and gentle hands quickly calmed her. Bella's large, liquid eyes watched them closely, and Emma smiled as the calf finally seemed to relax under their touch. "Good girl, Bella," Emma cooed. "You're doing great." John took a step back, admiring their work. "She's so much stronger already. It's amazing how quickly they bounce back." Emma smiled, feeling a warm glow of pride. "She's definitely a fighter." Once they were satisfied that Bella was clean and comfortable, they turned their attention to ensuring her nutrition needs were still being met. Emma made a note in her journal about the amount of milk Bella had taken in so far, making sure they kept track of everything for future reference. "You're already getting the hang of this, aren't you?" John remarked, watching as Emma continued to check off items on her list. "I'm trying," Emma laughed, "but I'm also keeping in mind that this is all new. The first few weeks are crucial, and we can't afford to overlook anything." John patted her on the back. "I think we're doing pretty well for first-timers." Just then, Bella let out a soft bleat, and both John and Emma turned their attention back to the calf, who had finally started to walk, albeit a bit wobbly, toward her mother for another round of nursing. Emma's heart swelled with happiness. Seeing Bella grow stronger by the day was exactly what they needed to reassure them that they were on the right path. "We've got a lot ahead of us," John said, "but it feels good to know we're making progress." Emma nodded. "Every day's a learning experience, but we're doing it together, and that's all that matters." As they stood in the soft glow of the barn, watching Bella and her mother bond, Emma couldn't help but think back to the lessons they'd learned from their visit to the dairy farm. There were so many things they hadn't expected, and so much they still had to figure out. But right now, as they stood together in the quiet of the barn, with the newborn calf in front of them, it felt like they had taken the first step on a long, rewarding journey. "We're ready for this," Emma said softly, glancing at John with a look of confidence in her eyes. John smiled and squeezed her hand. "We sure are." Chapter 5. Proper Nutrition for Cows. The morning sunlight poured through the barn doors, casting a warm, golden light across the sprawling farm. The dew on the grass shimmered like a blanket of tiny diamonds, and the air felt crisp, signaling that autumn was settling in. John and Emma stood by the pasture, their eyes following the movements of their new cow, Bella, who had now grown stronger and more confident with each passing day. The first calf had already learned to navigate the world, but today, their thoughts shifted toward the future. Specifically, the long-term care of their cows and, most importantly, their diet. John wiped his brow, looking across the field where the cows grazed on the lush, green pasture. It seemed peaceful enough, but he knew there was much more to it than just letting them roam free and eat whatever they could find. "We're going to need to get this right," he said, glancing over at Emma, who was scribbling notes in her journal. Emma nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. We've learned a lot about the basics of cow care, but when it comes to nutrition, there's so much more to understand. If we're going to keep them healthy, we need to make sure we're giving them the best possible diet. Johnne had been listening intently to what they had learned during their visit to the dairy farm, where they had been shown the importance of proper nutrition in maintaining a healthy and productive herd. They had been introduced to the different types of feed cows need, from hay and silage to grains and mineral supplements. But Emma's list of questions seemed to grow longer every day, and they both agreed that it was time to get serious about creating the best possible diet plan for their cows. "I think it's time we talk to a nutritionist," Emma said, pausing in her writing. "Someone who can really help us understand what each cow needs at different stages in their life. I've read a lot of information, but we could really use professional advice." Johnne rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I agree. We can't just rely on what we've read or seen. Every cow is different, and we need to make sure we're meeting all of their nutritional needs, especially with Bella growing up." The thought of Bella growing into a strong, healthy cow filled them both with anticipation. They both knew that proper feeding was key to ensuring that their cows would be able to produce enough milk, stay healthy, and live long, happy lives. It was also important for Bella, as she would eventually grow into a productive member of their herd. They had learned that proper nutrition would not only support her milk production, but also her overall health, and they were determined to get it right. Later that day, they set out to meet with a local animal nutritionist, a woman named Carol, who had worked with dairy farmers for years. Her office was located just outside the town, nestled in the back of a small, cozy barn-turned office, filled with bookshelves lined with binders and farm manuals. She greeted Johnne and Emma with a friendly smile and a firm handshake. "Welcome. I'm so glad you two came," Carol said as she led them inside. "I understand you've recently started your own herd?" Johnne nodded. "Yes, and we're trying to make sure we're doing everything right. We've got Bella now, and we plan on adding a few more cows. We want to get their diet sorted out so they stay healthy and produce good milk." Carol gestured to the two chairs at the table. "Well, you're in the right place. A proper diet is crucial for cows, and there are so many factors to consider, especially as they move through different stages of life. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but we can definitely figure out a plan for your herd." As they sat down, Carol started by asking them about their current feeding practices. "What are you feeding them now?" she asked, flipping open her notebook. "Hay? Grain?" Emma replied, "We've been giving Bella fresh grass from the pasture, along with some hay. But we're concerned about making sure she gets all the right nutrients, especially since she's still growing." Carol smiled reassuringly. "Grass is excellent. It's the foundation of a good diet. But as your cows get older, they'll need more than just grass. Hay is good for the winter months when fresh grass isn't available, but they'll also need grain for energy, especially if you want them to produce milk." Johnne looked puzzled. "How do we know how much grain they need?" "We've heard different things." Carol nodded. "That's a good question. Cows' energy needs vary depending on their age, size, and whether they're lactating. For a young calf like Bella, she's still growing and needs extra protein. As she matures and starts producing milk, her diet will need to include more energy and calcium, which is crucial for milk production. You'll need to supplement with grains like corn, oats, and barley." Emma jotted down notes furiously. "So what kind of grain should we start her on now?" "Since she's still a calf, you should focus on a high-protein feed. Alfalfa hay is great for young cows because it has a higher protein content than regular grass hay. You can mix in some grain when she gets a bit older, around 6 months, and gradually increase it as she grows. Don't forget the minerals, calcium, phosphorus, and salt are essential, especially for lactating cows." John's mind was racing as Carol explained all the different types of feeds and their benefits. He'd always known that cows ate a lot, but he had no idea just how complex their nutritional needs could be. Carol continued, "Once Bella starts producing milk, you'll need to provide a balanced ration to support her. This includes a mix of forage, like hay or silage, and concentrate feeds. You'll also need to adjust the amount of grain depending on her milk production and energy requirements. Some cows will need more protein if they're producing a lot of milk." Emma looked up from her notes. "How do we know when to make these changes?" "You'll want to keep a close eye on Bella's body condition and milk production. If she starts losing weight or if her milk production drops, that's a sign that her diet needs adjusting. Regular weight checks and monitoring her milk yield will give you clues. After spending over an hour discussing cow nutrition with Carol, Johnne and Emma left her office feeling more confident. They now understood the balance between different types of feed and the importance of adjusting their cow's diet as they matured and started producing milk. Carol had also given them a list of local suppliers where they could find high-quality feed and minerals, and Emma was already looking forward to trying out a few options. "Are you feeling more confident about this?" John asked as they drove home, glancing at Emma. "Definitely," Emma replied with a smile. "It's still a lot to take in, but I feel much better knowing we have a clear plan. We'll be able to support Bella's growth, and soon enough, we'll be ready for the others." John smiled back at her. "It's all part of the adventure, right?" Emma nodded. "Right. We're learning as we go, but we're on the right track." As they pulled into their driveway, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was filled with new challenges, but together, they were more than ready. With the knowledge of how to care for their cows properly, they would ensure that their herd would thrive, not only for their own benefit but for the future of their farm. Chapter 6. Cleaning the cow barn, a key to health. The first rays of morning light broke through the barn windows, casting long, soft shadows on the floor. The cows had already been let out to pasture, and John and Emma stood at the entrance of the barn, looking inside with a sense of both satisfaction and anticipation. The barn had served them well since they had first moved to the farm, but it was time to get serious about keeping things cleaner and healthier for their animals. After speaking to Carol, the animal nutritionist, about their cows' feeding needs, Emma had turned her attention to another aspect of farm life that would be just as crucial to their success: the barn itself. Cleanliness, they had learned during their trip to the dairy farm, was vital for preventing illness, managing waste, and promoting overall well-being for the cows. And the barn wasn't just about keeping it looking nice. It was about providing a safe and hygienic space for their animals to live and produce milk. "Ready to get our hands dirty?" John asked, grinning as he grabbed a shovel and a pitchfork. "I suppose we don't have much of a choice," Emma replied, rolling up her sleeves. She looked at the barn's interior, where hay had been scattered across the floor and a bit of manure had started to accumulate near the stalls. It wasn't anything that couldn't be cleaned up, but the task ahead of them was more than a simple sweep. "We need to do this thoroughly," Emma said, checking the barn's ventilation system. "The cows spend a lot of time in here, so it's crucial to keep everything clean, especially the stalls and feeding areas. A dirty barn can lead to infections, respiratory problems, and other health issues." John nodded, looking around the barn with a sense of determination. "I've noticed that the cows aren't staying as clean as I thought they would. And the smell, well, it's gotten a bit stronger. It's a reminder that regular cleaning is more than just an occasional task. We need to stay on top of it." The first step, they knew, was to remove all the soiled bedding and manure that had built up over the past few days. They had read about different types of bedding for cows: straw, sawdust, and even sand, but for now they had decided to stick with straw since it was abundant and affordable. Emma grabbed a pitchfork and began moving the old bedding, tossing it into a large composting pile they'd set up outside. John followed her lead, clearing out the remaining straw and making room for fresh bedding. As they worked, Emma reflected on the importance of this task. The barn wasn't just a shelter for the cows. It was their home, and like any home, it needed constant care and attention. After all, keeping the cows in a clean environment was a direct reflection of how well they were taking care of them. "This reminds me of the time we had to clean the chicken coop," Emma mused, pushing aside some of the old hay. "It was never as bad as this, but it's still a big job." John chuckled. "At least the chickens don't make as much mess as cows do. I thought pigs were bad, but this takes the cake." "I don't mind the work, as long as we know it's making a difference," Emma said, pausing for a moment to wipe her brow. "But we'll need to stay consistent. I don't think we can afford to let things pile up again." "No argument here," John agreed. "And we need to keep the ventilation working well, too. It's easy to overlook, but if the air gets too damp in here, it can cause mold and bacteria to grow." The barn had already been equipped with a basic ventilation system, but they decided to do a quick check to make sure everything was functioning properly. The air should be fresh and dry, free from any lingering moisture that could lead to respiratory problems in the cows. As John adjusted the vents, Emma opened the barn doors to let in some fresh air, feeling the cool breeze on her face. Once they had cleared out the bedding and checked the ventilation, it was time to scrub the floors. Emma filled a bucket with soapy water, and they both set to work scrubbing the floors and the walls of the stalls. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. They worked in quiet concentration, the only sounds being the gentle swish of the scrubbing brushes and the occasional grunt of effort. "This part is surprisingly satisfying," John remarked, his face flushed from the work. "It feels good to know that the cows will be in a clean environment." Emma smiled at him. "You're right. There's something comforting about it. It's like we're giving them the best chance to thrive." As they finished cleaning the stalls and the feeding areas, John paused and looked at the barn. The difference was noticeable. The floor gleamed, the air was fresher, and everything seemed brighter. They had worked hard, but the rewards were already starting to show. Emma walked over to the freshly cleaned feeding area and placed a pile of fresh hay for the cows. The barn was ready for the animals to return. "I think we're done here," she said, standing back to admire their work. "This place looks great," John agreed, wiping his hands on his overalls. "It'll be a lot easier to maintain from now on, too, now that we've got the routine down." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need to clean the barn thoroughly every couple of weeks, and then just do regular spot checks to keep it from getting too bad. But overall, we've got it under control." John smiled and put a hand on her shoulder. "We make a good team." The cows were starting to return from the pasture, and as they entered the barn, Emma and John watched them settle into their freshly cleaned spaces. Bella, who was now growing taller and more independent, stepped lightly into her stall, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. Her eyes met Emma's, and Emma felt a surge of warmth as she watched the calf sniff around and settle in for the night. The barn was no longer just a place for their cows to sleep. It was a clean, welcoming home where they could thrive, and that, Emma knew, was the foundation for everything that came next. "We're learning, John," Emma said quietly, as she watched the cows. "We sure are," he replied with a smile. "And the more we learn, the better they'll be." As they closed the barn doors and stood outside, watching the evening sun dip below the horizon, they both felt a quiet satisfaction. The work was hard, but it was rewarding. And with every task, they were one step closer to creating the farm they had always dreamed of. One where their cows and all their animals could flourish. Chapter 7. The Art of Milking a Gentle Routine. The barn was quiet in the early morning, the world still half asleep as the first light of dawn stretched across the sky. John stood by the door of the barn, stretching and yawning as he looked out at the pasture where the cows grazed peacefully. It was a calm, serene scene, but today was different. Today they would try something they had only read about before: milking the cows. "Ready for this?" John asked, turning to Emma, who was carefully preparing a bucket, a towel, and the milking equipment they had purchased just the day before. "I think so," Emma replied, adjusting her glasses as she checked the milking pail. "I've read about it, but I'm still a little nervous. It's not like feeding them or cleaning the barn." John chuckled, taking a deep breath. "No, it's definitely a bit more involved. But we've been preparing for this moment for weeks. We've seen it done, and now it's our turn." Emma nodded. Over the past few days, they had been learning about the milking process, both from their own research and from the lessons they had picked up during their trip to the dairy farm. They had watched how the farmers would approach each cow gently and calmly, knowing that the cows were sensitive creatures. They had also learned the importance of cleanliness and proper technique. Milking wasn't just about getting the milk. It was about forming a bond with the animal, respecting her, and ensuring her comfort. The first step, Emma knew, was to make sure Bella, their first cow, was calm and settled before starting the milking process. They had chosen Bella because she had been the easiest to handle, and she seemed the most comfortable with their presence. She had already become accustomed to their touch during their previous visits to the barn, so the hope was that this process wouldn't be too stressful for her, or for them. John led Bella into the barn, where they had set up a simple milking station. It was a small, quiet space with a few stools, a bucket, and the milking equipment they had carefully prepared. Bella entered the barn without hesitation, her gentle moo filling the air. She stood obediently in her designated spot, looking at Emma with soft, curious eyes. Emma sat down on the stool beside Bella, who was munching on a bit of hay as they began to get set up. John stood nearby, ready to help if needed. Emma wiped her hands with a clean towel and began by gently cleaning Bella's udder with warm water and a bit of soap. She had learned from Carol, the animal nutritionist, that cleanliness was essential in avoiding any contamination of the milk, and it was also important for Bella's health. "Almost ready," Emma said, glancing up at John as she finished cleaning. Bella was standing patiently, her big eyes flicking between Emma and John. It was clear that Bella trusted them, but Emma knew this was the moment where they had to be calm and steady, or the process might be difficult for both of them. John moved closer, offering quiet words of encouragement. "You're doing great, Emma. Just remember what we saw." Gentle and steady, Emma took a deep breath and nodded. She reached for the udder, gently cupping her hand around it. Bella shifted slightly but didn't pull away, and Emma felt a sense of relief. This was going to work. With a steady rhythm, Emma began to gently squeeze the milk from Bella's udder, watching as it streamed into the bucket below. The sound of the milk hitting the metal pail was soothing, almost meditative. For a moment, Emma was lost in the process. The soft, steady flow of milk, Bella's calm demeanor, and the quiet barn all blended together into a peaceful, intimate experience. This was the connection they had been working toward, a bond between them and the animal that would provide sustenance for their family. John watched silently from the side, offering occasional support when needed. "You're doing great," he said softly, giving Emma a reassuring smile. "It's just like we saw at the farm." Emma continued, her rhythm steady and confident now. It was a delicate process, but with each pull, she became more comfortable. Bella, too, seemed to relax into the routine, her big brown eyes fixed on Emma with a quiet trust. Emma felt a deep sense of pride as she realized that she was providing for their farm, for their future, and for the animals they had promised to care for. As the milking continued, Emma marveled at how natural it had become. She was no longer nervous. Instead, she felt a connection with Bella, a sense of gratitude for the cow's patience and trust. The barn was still, save for the sound of the milk being drawn, the occasional shuffle of Bella's hooves, and the distant clatter of a crow in the trees. After a while, John leaned in and whispered, "I think that's enough for today. Let's give her a break." Emma nodded and gently released her hold on Bella's udder, offering her a pat of reassurance. Bella looked up at her and gave a soft snort, as if to say, "Good job." They both stood up, and John took the filled pail, carefully placing it on a nearby table. Emma wiped her hands once more, smiling at Bella. "Thank you, girl," she said softly. With the milking complete, the next step was to store the milk properly. They had learned from their trip to the dairy farm that it was crucial to chill the milk as quickly as possible to preserve its freshness and quality. John carefully poured the milk into clean glass jars, sealing them tightly before placing them in a cooler filled with ice. As Emma watched, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It had been a messy and somewhat awkward process at first, but now it felt natural. The bond between them and Bella was growing stronger, and the feeling of self-sufficiency was beginning to sink in. "Not so bad, right?" John asked with a grin, his hands still tinged with milk. Emma smiled back. "Not bad at all. I think we've got this." They took a moment to admire their work. 2 full jars of fresh, warm milk. It felt like the first step in a long journey, but one that was filled with promise. As they walked out of the barn together, they were already planning ahead. There were still many things to learn and many steps to take, but the success of their first milking had filled them both with a sense of pride and purpose. They were no longer just caring for animals. They were building something meaningful, something that would sustain them and their farm for years to come. "We make a good team, Emma," John said, looking over at her with a smile. Emma nodded, her heart light. "We sure do." Chapter 8. The Art of Milking, Mastering the Process. The morning air was crisp, and the sky was just beginning to brighten as Emma walked toward the barn. The cows were still out in the pasture, grazing contentedly as they always did at this time of day, and the soft sound of their lowing mixed with the rustle of the wind through the trees. The barn was quiet, waiting for them to begin the morning's routine. It had been a few weeks since their first attempt at milking Bella, and in that time, Emma and John had grown more confident with each passing day. The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a steady rhythm. Bella, their most reliable cow, had grown accustomed to the process, and Emma had learned to move more fluidly, her motions now more practiced and less hesitant. But despite their progress, there was still a lot to learn, and Emma knew that today would be another important step in honing their skills. "Good morning, Bella," Emma whispered as she approached the barn. She gently opened the door and Bella, who was already standing in her stall, turned her head toward Emma, offering a soft moo. Emma smiled, running her hand gently along Bella's side, feeling the familiar warmth of her coat. "Ready for round 2, Bella?" Emma said softly, almost as if Bella could answer. John was already inside, setting up the milking station. He had been carefully inspecting the milking equipment, making sure everything was clean and ready for use. They had learned that cleanliness was even more important now, especially as they got more milk on a regular basis. The fresh milk needed to be handled properly to avoid contamination or spoilage, so they had been very careful about hygiene ever since their first successful milking. John turned as Emma entered the barn, a grin on his face. "How's Bella feeling today? Ready to give us some milk?" "I think so," Emma replied, glancing at their cow as she chewed contentedly on a bit of hay. "She looks pretty calm. Let's give it a go." They went through the same preparation as always, cleaning Bella's udder with warm water and a clean towel, making sure to be gentle, not rushing, as they had learned during their trip to the dairy farm. The importance of creating a relaxed atmosphere for the cows couldn't be overstated. If they were too quick or too rough, it would stress the animals, and it would make milking more difficult for everyone. Emma settled down onto the stool next to Bella. John stood close by, ready to help if needed. The first time they milked Bella, Emma had been nervous, unsure of the rhythm and technique. Now she felt more in control. As she cupped her hand around the udder, the familiar feeling of the warm, soft skin beneath her fingers made her more comfortable. "Nice and steady," John encouraged. "Remember to keep the pressure even and pull down, not out." Emma nodded, focusing on the gentle movements. She squeezed, drawing the milk from the udder, her motions now smooth and practiced. The milk began to flow steadily into the metal bucket below, the sound of it hitting the bottom soft and rhythmic. Bella stood calmly, her eyes half closed in contentment, clearly used to the process by now. For a moment, Emma lost herself in the task, her hands moving without much thought as she focused on Bella's comfort. She had learned to appreciate the quiet intimacy of the moment, the connection between her and the cow, the steady rhythm of the milking process, and the peacefulness of the barn. Each milking session, she felt more confident, more at ease with her role as a caretaker of the animals. John, watching closely, gave a quiet nod of approval. "You're getting the hang of it. You're much smoother now." Emma smiled up at him, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. "It feels easier now. I think Bella's getting used to me." "She definitely is," John said, stepping closer to give Emma a hand with the pail. "We're doing well. I think we can start milking both cows soon, once the others are ready." Emma nodded, considering the possibility. "We'll need to be prepared for that. More milk means more work, but we're ready for it. Bella's teaching us the ropes." By the time they had finished milking, they had collected a generous amount of milk, enough for the day, and perhaps even enough to share with some of their neighbors. Emma carefully poured the milk into clean jars, sealing them tightly. John helped by bringing over the cooler, and they transferred the jars into the ice pack storage. As Emma wiped her hands clean and stood up, she felt a quiet pride wash over her. They were no longer fumbling their way through the process. They had developed a rhythm, and each day seemed to bring a little more confidence. Bella was a patient teacher, and Emma felt a deep appreciation for the bond that had formed between them. "You know," Emma said, turning to John as they stood together in the barn, "I never expected milking to be so personal. It's more than just getting the milk. It's about trusting each other, Bella trusting us, and us making sure she's okay. It's like building a relationship. John grinned, his eyes warm with pride. That's exactly it. It's a partnership, just like everything else on this farm. Emma chuckled, glancing at Bella, who had settled back into her stall, now content after the milking. I never imagined we'd be here, doing this together. It's a lot more work than I thought, but it's also a lot more rewarding than I expected. Yep, John said, giving her a playful nudge. And this is just the beginning. We've got more cows coming, and plenty more to learn. But I wouldn't want to do this with anyone else. Emma smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment in her heart. They had come a long way from the time when they had first considered bringing cows to their farm. Now, with each passing day, they were building a life together that was rooted in care, patience, and the simple joys of working alongside each other. As the barn grew quieter and the day began to stretch on, Emma and John stood together, looking at their milk-filled jars, proud of their progress. There was still a long road ahead, but they were learning and growing with each step, and with Bella's gentle guidance, they were more ready than ever to take the next one. We're doing great, Emma said quietly. We sure are, John replied, smiling as he looked around the barn, feeling content in the peace of the morning. Chapter 9. Cow Health Prevention and Care. The sun was already high in the sky as Emma and John entered the barn, their boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the cow stalls. Today was a different kind of day, their first real introduction to the world of cow health. They had heard about the importance of keeping their animals in good health, but today they were about to get a closer look at the practical side of things. They had scheduled a visit from Dr. Turner, the local veterinarian, to help them learn more about preventing illness in their cows and the steps to take when something went wrong. It was a bit intimidating, but Emma knew it was necessary. The well-being of their cows was crucial to the farm's success, and they needed to be prepared for any situation. Morning, Emma. Morning, John. Dr. Turner greeted them as they walked into the barn. He was a kind man in his mid-50s, with weathered hands and a steady, confident manner that immediately put Emma at ease. He had a reputation for being thorough and approachable, qualities that made him the go-to vet in their small town. Good morning, Dr. Turner, Emma said, smiling. We're glad you're here. We've been reading a lot, but there's still so much we don't know. That's the best attitude to have, Dr. Turner replied with a smile. As long as you're willing to learn, you're already ahead of the game. John nodded, looking over at Bella and the other cows in their stalls. We want to make sure we're doing everything right. We've learned a lot about feeding and milking, but health is something we've been a bit nervous about. Dr. Turner motioned for them to follow him into the cow area, where the cows were peacefully grazing. Health is everything when it comes to farming. Without it, you don't have a farm, really. So, let's take a look at your cows and I'll show you what to watch for. The first cow Dr. Turner examined was Bella. He moved slowly, checking her over with a calm touch. His hands moved with the ease of experience as he felt along Bella's sides, checking for any signs of discomfort, inspecting her hooves, and carefully feeling her udder for any irregularities. You want to make sure her udder is clean. Of course, Dr. Turner explained, as he gently felt Bella's udder for any swelling or hard spots. It's a common place for infection, so make sure you're checking regularly. If you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to call me. Emma and John nodded, watching carefully. They had learned about mastitis, an infection of the udder that could affect the milk quality, but seeing it firsthand made the reality of cow health even more important. What's the best way to prevent that? Emma asked, her concern evident. Good hygiene is key, Dr. Turner replied, wiping his hands on a cloth before moving to Bella's hooves. Keep the barn clean, and make sure the cow's bedding is dry. If their environment is too wet, it can lead to hoof problems and infections. Regular inspections of their hooves are just as important as udder care. Emma and John exchanged glances, already thinking about ways to improve the barn's setup. They had kept things relatively tidy, but they hadn't been as vigilant about checking the cow's hooves regularly. Let's take a look at her hooves now, Dr. Turner continued. He carefully lifted each of Bella's hooves one by one, checking for cracks, infections, or any signs of distress. Bella stood patiently, accustomed to the attention. Dr. Turner demonstrated how to clean and trim the hooves. This is something you'll need to do every few months, depending on the cow. If you're unsure, I can come by for a hoof trimming session, but it's important that you get comfortable with it. Healthy hooves mean healthy cows. John stepped forward, interested. How can we tell if there's a problem before it gets serious? Look for signs of limping or hesitation when they walk, Dr. Turner explained. If you see any, it's time to check their hooves. A cow with a sore hoof won't walk properly, and that's when things can start to escalate. Prevention is the key. After finishing with Bella, Dr. Turner moved to the other cows, repeating the process. They followed him closely, absorbing every piece of information he offered. He explained that cows, like all animals, were masters at hiding pain. By the time they showed visible signs of distress, it could be too late. Do you ever worry about them getting sick? Emma asked, her voice full of concern. How do you know when it's serious? Dr. Turner smiled, his eyes twinkling with kindness. That's a great question. It's all about monitoring their behavior. Cows are pretty good at letting you know when something's wrong, but they don't always show it immediately. If a cow stops eating, becomes lethargic, or shows signs of a fever, you've got a problem. You need to act quickly to prevent things from getting worse. John looked at the cows as they calmly grazed, their peaceful demeanor a sharp contrast to the responsibility of keeping them healthy. So, regular checks are a must? Absolutely, Dr. Turner replied. Check for any changes in behavior, check their temperature, make sure they're eating and drinking properly, and don't forget the hoof care. If you notice anything unusual, don't wait. A call to your vet could save you a lot of trouble down the road. The visit continued with a discussion about vaccinations, including those for diseases like tuberculosis, and the importance of maintaining proper records for each cow's health. Emma took notes diligently, making sure not to miss any important information. Dr. Turner even showed them how to administer basic shots, which would be necessary as their herd grew. He emphasized the need for routine health checks and record-keeping to track vaccinations and treatments. As the session wound down, Emma felt a sense of clarity and responsibility settling over her. There was so much to learn, but Dr. Turner had given them the tools to properly care for their cows. It wasn't just about feeding or milking. It was about building a system of care, one that involved constant monitoring, awareness, and a commitment to the animal's well-being. We'll be sure to keep up with everything, Emma said, smiling at Dr. Turner. Thanks for showing us all this. It's a lot to take in, but we're ready. You're doing a great job, Dr. Turner said with a warm smile. Remember, I'm just a phone call away if you need me. As he left the barn, Emma and John stood for a moment, looking at their cows. They felt the weight of their responsibility, but it was balanced with a sense of pride. They had made the decision to take care of these animals, and now they were learning the importance of that commitment. Keeping them healthy was just as important as anything else they had done on the farm, and with the right knowledge and tools, they were confident they could meet the challenge head-on. Emma turned to John, her eyes bright with determination. We've got this, John. We're ready for whatever comes next. John grinned and nodded. We sure are. Chapter 10. Returning home, new plans, and fresh beginnings. The drive home was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the truck's engine the only sound accompanying them as they wound their way through the winding country roads. The morning had been full of new information, and Emma felt the weight of it settling in. They had learned so much from Dr. Turner about the health and care of their cows, and while she felt a sense of accomplishment, there was also a sense of responsibility that came with the knowledge. As the familiar sights of their farm came into view, Emma looked over at John. He was focused on the road ahead, his hand resting casually on the wheel. He was always the steady one, the one who kept things grounded when she started to worry about the details. How do you feel about everything we learned today? Emma asked, her voice thoughtful. John turned to her briefly, a smile tugging at his lips. I think we're in good shape. We've got the basics down, and now it's just a matter of keeping up with it all. We'll be fine. Emma nodded, a sense of reassurance filling her. She knew John was right. They had put in the work to learn about caring for the animals, and now it was time to put that knowledge into action. There would be more challenges ahead, but they were ready for them. As they reached the farm, The sight of the cows grazing peacefully in the pasture seemed like a reminder of what they had built together. It was more than just a farm. It was their life, their shared dream, and it was slowly becoming a reality. They had made the decision to start small, 5 cows, but that was only the beginning. The more they learned, the more they realized how much potential their little farm had. "We need to make a plan," Emma said as they pulled into the driveway. "We've got the basics down, but there are still things to figure out. The barn, the feed, the health checks, we need to stay on top of all of it." John turned off the truck and glanced at her with a knowing look. "I was thinking the same thing. I think it's time to start mapping out what we need to do. We can start with the barn, make sure we have the right setup for all the cows. Maybe even start thinking about a few more down the line. But we'll take it slow. There's no rush." Emma smiled, her heart lightened by the calm assurance in John's voice. "You're right. One step at a time. I think we've got a good rhythm going, and we just need to keep it going." They both got out of the truck, stretching their legs after the long drive, and walked toward the barn. The cows were still grazing in the distance, but the barn felt different now, like it was ready to be the heart of something bigger. As they approached, Emma paused and took in the sight of the animals. They had learned so much about their care, their needs, and what it took to keep them healthy and happy. But there was more to do. John noticed her pause and gave her a questioning glance. "What's on your mind?" "I was just thinking about all the little things we still need to do," Emma said, a thoughtful frown crossing her face. "We need to make sure we have a proper feeding schedule. And we should probably look into expanding the barn if we want to bring in more cows. Plus, there's the fencing. We'll need stronger fences for the future." John nodded, clearly agreeing with her. "We'll get there. One thing at a time. We'll start with a plan and go from there. Maybe we can start by organizing the feeding area and seeing if we need any upgrades in the barn." Emma smiled, her confidence growing. "That sounds like a good place to start. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. But it feels good to know we're headed in the right direction." The two of them spent the rest of the afternoon walking the farm, making notes on what needed attention. They discussed everything from the state of the barn to how they would manage the increased workload as they planned to bring in more cows. They both knew that their dreams were beginning to take shape, and while there would be challenges ahead, they were ready to face them together. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the farm, Emma stood with John by the pasture fence, watching the cows in the distance. The quiet sound of their lowing mixed with the rustling of the leaves in the trees, and Emma felt a deep sense of peace. This was their life now, and they had worked hard to get here. "We're really doing it, aren't we?" Emma asked softly, her eyes scanning the land around them. John smiled, his arm resting casually around her shoulders. "Yeah, we are. And we're just getting started." Emma leaned into him, her heart swelling with pride and excitement for the future. They had a lot of work ahead of them, but they were ready for it. They had learned so much, and there was still so much to learn. But they were in this together, and that made all the difference. As they stood together, watching the sunset over the fields, Emma couldn't help but feel grateful for the life they were building. The cows, the barn, the animals, they were all part of something bigger than just a farm. They were part of a dream, one that was coming to life with every passing day. And the future, whatever it held, was theirs to shape.